On New Year's Eve 1989, Princess Diana said something she never expected the British public to hear. She felt sad and empty. Then, speaking privately to James Gilbey, she described her marriage with 2 words that stripped away years of smiling photographs and royal appearances: real torture. This wasn't Diana at a microphone. It wasn't Diana walking through a hospital ward or stepping out of a royal car while photographers shouted her name. She was at Sandringham, apparently speaking from a landline, believing the conversation belonged only to her and Gilbey, who was on a mobile phone. Britain already knew Diana's public voice. This was the other one: private, frustrated, funny in places, wounded in others, unfiltered in a way the public had almost never heard before. Gilbey reassured her. Diana moved from pain to ordinary chatter and back again. There was affection between them, and years later Diana herself would confirm that the conversation was genuine. But here's where the story splits. Diana didn't know she was being heard. She certainly didn't know she was being recorded. The conversation took place in 1989. It wouldn't explode across Britain until almost 3 years later. And once you follow what happened to that private voice between those 2 moments, Squidgygate becomes something far more troubling than the nickname everyone remembers. This story has 2 layers. One is documented. The other is still disputed. We're going to follow both, and we're going to keep them separate. Where the evidence supports a claim, we'll say so. Where it doesn't, we'll say that too. Because the most important thing about Squidgygate isn't who people suspect, it's what can actually be proved. And what can be proved begins with a question most retellings skip too quickly. Who was James Gilbey before that nickname swallowed his entire identity? James Gilbey eventually became famous for one word. That's the problem. Once the newspapers attached Squidgy to his name, almost everything else about him disappeared behind it. He became the man on the telephone, the supposed lover. The other voice on Diana's most embarrassing private recording. But before that tape reached the public, Gilbey already belonged to a world Diana knew. He wasn't a stranger who materialized during the collapse of her marriage. Later accounts place their acquaintance before Diana married Charles. He worked around Lotus cars. Contemporary photo archives identify him as a Lotus marketing manager, and later reporting described him as a former Lotus car dealer. He moved in the sort of well-connected British social circles where knowing Diana before she became one of the most photographed women in the world wasn't unusual. And there's something about him that makes him rare in Diana's story. He largely kept quiet. Years after Diana's death, the Telegraph noted that Gilbey was among the few men romantically linked with her who hadn't turned the relationship into a public account of his own. No memoir built around Diana. No long television confession. No steady stream of interviews explaining what he claimed had happened between them. So what was he to Diana? The honest description is this: a close friend and emotionally intimate confidant who was romantically linked with her. The recording makes his affection unmistakable. What it doesn't settle, by itself, is whether their relationship was sexual. Diana was asked that directly, on camera, in November 1995. During her Panorama interview with Martin Bashir, she didn't deny the telephone conversation. She denied what people had constructed from it. Diana described Gilbey as a very affectionate person. Then she said the implication that they had maintained an adulterous relationship was not true. And that answer carries weight. It doesn't always receive. Because in the same interview, when Bashir raised James Hewitt, Diana openly acknowledged that she had loved him. So when she rejected the adultery claim involving Gilbey, it wasn't a blanket insistence that she'd never crossed a line with anyone. She was making a specific distinction about a specific man. Now, we need to address the interview itself before we go further, because we're going to use it more than once, and this context shouldn't have to be repeated every time. Lord Dyson's 2021 investigation found that Bashir had commissioned fake bank statements, shown them to Diana's brother Earl Spencer, and used deception to engineer the introduction that gave him access to Diana. That's a serious breach. But Dyson also concluded that Diana was already interested in giving a BBC interview, and probably would have agreed to speak with another suitable BBC journalist anyway. She wrote after the broadcast that she'd consented without undue pressure, and had no regrets. Dyson accepted that note as genuine. So the responsible way to handle Panorama is this. Its origins were compromised by Bashir's deception. Diana's own recorded answers are still Diana's own recorded answers. When she speaks about Gilbey, about the tape, about what she believed happened, those are her words, not Bashir's. We'll use them accordingly. And on Gilbey, her answer is clear enough to let us move on to the thing that actually matters. Not the label placed on their relationship, the sound of it. Because if you stop trying to decide whether Diana and Gilbey were lovers, and simply listen to how they talk, something more interesting appears, he reassures her. He lets her complain. He doesn't seem startled when she shifts from something painful to something completely ordinary. There's a familiarity between them that doesn't need explaining every few sentences. Diana doesn't sound as though she's carefully managing his opinion of her. That's why Gilbey matters to this story. Not because we need one more name for a list of men associated with Diana. He matters because around him, some of Diana's normal defenses appear to drop. The Princess of Wales was surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Access, approval, a photograph, a performance, a decision. With Gilbey, at least during the conversation that survived, she could complain without first polishing the complaint into something acceptable. And by the closing days of 1989, that trust had created something nobody involved could have expected. One of the most unguarded records of Diana's private life was about to be made. And Diana had no idea that James Gilbey wasn't the only person who would eventually hear it. To understand why Diana needed somebody like Gilbey at the end of 1989, you don't need to retell 11 years of royal marriage. You only need to see the split screen. On one side stood the Princess of Wales, the public still recognised. She and Charles remained husband and wife. They continued performing royal duties. They were parents to William and Harry. The public structure was intact. Privately, the marriage underneath it was badly damaged. But here's the detail most retellings blur. Charles and Diana didn't announce a separation in 1989. That wouldn't come until 9th of December 1992, when John Major told the House of Commons that the Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to separate. Christmas 1989 wasn't a formal separation. And that's exactly what makes the period so suffocating. The marriage could still function in public while failing in private. And for Diana, Sandringham at Christmas made that contrast unbearable. Royal Christmas wasn't a private family holiday in any ordinary sense. There were traditions, church, family expectations, and the knowledge that cameras were always nearby. Diana had long found those gatherings difficult. Her later accounts described Sandringham Christmases as tense and highly structured. But we don't have to reconstruct her emotional state from somebody else's memory. Diana gave us her own evidence. Not in a formal speech, not in an interview recorded years later, in the conversation itself. And what that conversation reveals isn't what the headlines made people think. The conversation doesn't begin like a royal confession. That's the first thing worth noticing. There's no dramatic announcement. Diana doesn't pick up the telephone and unload every secret of her marriage. Gilbey talks to her the way somebody does when they already know the answer might not be good. He asks about the lows of her day, and Diana starts talking. She tells him she'd almost broken down during lunch. She says she'd nearly started blubbing. That phrase matters because it sounds nothing like a polished royal statement. It's casual, almost embarrassed. The sort of thing you say to somebody who already knows you've been struggling, and then she moves on. That's how the entire conversation works. 1 minute she's describing the pressure she feels around the royal family. The next, the conversation drifts somewhere entirely different. Then the pain returns. There isn't a neat beginning, middle and end. There are waves. The first is exhaustion. Diana sounds worn down by the effort of maintaining herself inside an environment where she feels watched, judged and discussed. She talks about lunch. She talks about almost crying. She speaks with the irritation of somebody who has reached the end of her patience. Then comes the marriage. Not as a legal question, not as a constitutional problem, as something she has to live inside. She talks about pressure, about feeling boxed in, about what life with Charles is doing to her emotionally. And because she isn't speaking to an interviewer, she doesn't stop to explain the background. Gilbey seems to know it already. That might be one of the most important clues to the nature of their friendship. The conversation doesn't sound like Diana introducing Gilbey to her problems. It sounds like another episode in an ongoing exchange. He understands the characters, he understands the mood. He knows when to reassure her and when simply to let her continue. PBS's archival account describes Diana talking about her alienation while Gilbey comforts her. Then the royal family enters the conversation directly. Diana talks about getting weird looks from the Queen Mother. She doesn't claim to know exactly what those looks mean. She tries to interpret them. Pity? Interest? Something in between? That uncertainty is more revealing than most of the transcript's famous lines. Publicly, every glance between senior royals could be photographed and interpreted by newspapers. Privately, Diana was doing some of that interpreting herself. Who was looking at her? What had they heard? What did they think she might do? That sense of being watched sits quietly underneath the entire conversation, long before surveillance becomes the story. Then, suddenly, all that weight gives way to something almost absurdly ordinary. Television comes up. People they know come up. There's gossip. There are little jokes. The conversation passes through the kind of everyday subjects that would never survive into an official account of royal life. And this ordinary material matters more than it seems. If the tape contained nothing except dramatic statements about Charles and the royal family, it would sound too perfect, like a confession assembled for publication. Instead, Diana wanders. She changes subjects. She says something raw, then something completely mundane. She sounds distracted. Human conversations do that. And then there's a side of Diana the public knew even less about: spiritual belief. During the call, she talks about people she loved who had died, and her conviction that they remained present in some form, watching over her. Accounts of the transcript also record her mentioning a conversation with the Bishop of Norwich about those beliefs. This isn't there because she's building a public image. It simply comes up. Then Gilbey brings the conversation back toward her. His affection is unmistakable. He calls her darling repeatedly. He uses the pet name that will eventually swallow the entire scandal. He tells her how much he wants to see her. He talks openly about missing her and being possessive when he sees photographs of her. Contemporary reporting noted he used darling dozens of times throughout the conversation. The newspapers counted every one. Those details were perfect for a headline, but listen carefully to the direction of the affection. Most of the overt romantic language comes from Gilbey. Diana's replies are warm, grateful, sometimes playful. She tells him, in one especially telling response to his support, "You'll never know how much." That line reveals something the nickname never could. Gilbey wasn't simply flattering Diana, he was giving her something she felt she wasn't getting elsewhere: reassurance, attention, a place to complain without having to defend herself. And here is the thing that should change how anyone hears this tape. Remove the nickname completely. Erase every squidgy and every darling from the transcript. The tape is still extraordinary. Diana is still talking about feeling emotionally cornered. She's still trying to read the behavior of people around her. She's still leaning on Gilbey for reassurance. She's still moving between anger, humor, hurt, and ordinary chatter, without knowing that strangers will someday study every shift in her voice. That's the real exposure, not a pet name, a private emotional system. The public Princess of Wales had duties, appearances, speeches, and carefully managed moments. The Diana on this telephone had complaints she didn't clean up, fears she didn't package, beliefs she didn't explain, and a man she trusted enough to hear all of it. The woman in those thousands of photographs might be smiling, while privately trying to understand why somebody at lunch had stared at her. She might be performing a royal role, while feeling the social structure around her closing in. She might be surrounded by one of the most famous families in the world, and still need a man outside that family to tell her she was worth something. And Gilbey does exactly that. But once the tape became public, all of it, the exhaustion, the spiritual searching, the gossip, the loneliness, the television chatter, would be crushed into 5 words: evidence of an affair. A headline can make a claim that fast. The evidence behind this one was never that simple. And once that distinction is made, the biggest question in the story changes completely. If the most sensational claim about the relationship couldn't be proved from the recording, then the real scandal may not have been what Diana said at all. It was how a conversation she believed was private ended up on somebody else's tape recorder. And the first man publicly placed at the center of that mystery wasn't a spy, he was a retired bank manager in Oxfordshire. Cyril Reenan didn't look like the beginning of an intelligence mystery. He was 70 years old, a retired bank manager living in Abingdon, Oxfordshire, and he liked listening to radio transmissions. When his name became public in September 1992, The Independent described Reenan as a radio ham who used a scanner to pick up the telephone conversation believed to be between Diana and James Gilbey. The scanner, Reenan said, had cost about £900. His explanation was remarkably mundane. He was listening. A woman's voice came through. He recognized it as Diana, and he recorded it. Later accounts added a strange little detail about his hobby. Reenan said he kept a tape recorder nearby because he sometimes recorded conversations involving racehorse trainers and used what he heard when placing bets. In his version of events, Diana's voice simply appeared during the sort of listening he was already doing. No dramatic break-in, no man hiding outside Sandringham with headphones, no secret file marked Princess of Wales. Just a scanner, a tape recorder, and a man in Oxfordshire who suddenly believed he was hearing one of the most famous women in the world. And then Reenan had a problem. What do you do once you've recorded something like that? He eventually took the recording to The Sun. According to the Independent September 1992 reporting, Reenan said the newspaper had warned him he could face prosecution and had promised his identity wouldn't be revealed. He said he'd expected far more money than he had actually received. By the time his name became public, Reenan sounded frightened by what he'd started. He told the Oxford Mail that his family had received hate mail and that the affair had made their lives miserable. He called making the recording the biggest mistake of his life. Then he said something that changes the tone of his entire role in this story. Knowing what he knew by then, Reenan said he would have tried to warn Diana that her conversations were being overheard. That doesn't undo the decision to record her. It doesn't undo taking the tape to a newspaper, but it makes him harder to cast as a villain. He appears less like a mastermind than a man who picked up something extraordinary, made decisions he later regretted, and then lost control of what happened next. And control is the important word here. Because once The Sun had the recording, Reenan no longer decided when Britain would hear it. He didn't control how the conversation would be edited. He didn't control the headlines, and eventually he would publicly question whether everything printed as part of his recording had actually come from his tape. That's where his apparently simple scanner story starts to come apart. At first, the public had been given a neat chain. Gilbey uses a mobile telephone. A hobbyist with the right scanner happens to pick up the signal. He presses record. The tape reaches a newspaper. End of mystery. And in the early analog mobile phone era, the basic idea of radio enthusiasts overhearing mobile traffic wasn't absurd. Those calls didn't carry the privacy protections people later came to expect. But Reenan's account contained a detail that would become very awkward. He said he knew when he'd made his recording, and the date he remembered didn't match the date the conversation was supposed to have taken place. That problem would soon matter enormously. But even that wasn't the strangest part. Because while the public was being introduced to Cyril Reenan as the man who had captured Diana's private conversation, The Sun was forced to acknowledge something else. Reenan wasn't the only person with a recording. Somewhere else in Oxfordshire, another tape existed. And once that second tape entered the story, coincidence became a much harder word to use. On 6 September 1992, less than 2 weeks after Squidgygate burst into public view, The Independent pointed to a change in The Sun's account. Cyril Reenan was no longer the only source. The newspaper had acknowledged receiving another, fuller version of the Diana Gilbey conversation. Contemporary reporting said the second material had reached The Sun separately. One amateur listener accidentally catching a royal telephone call is unusual. 2 recordings of the same private conversation demand a very different kind of explanation. Later reporting identified the second Oxfordshire listener as Jane Norgrove, then 25 years old. Vanity Fair's February 1993 reconstruction reported that Norgrove said she had made her recording on New Year's Eve. And here's where the dates collide. The conversation itself contained references consistent with New Year's Eve. Norgrove was reported as saying that was when she recorded it. Renan insisted his recording had been made on 4th of January 1990. Not New Year's Eve, January 4th, 5 days later. And Renan added another complication. When he saw the transcript published on the 24th of August, he reportedly said that substantial portions of it weren't on the recording he had made. The version Britain was reading contained material that, according to the man who was supposed to have captured it, couldn't all have come from his tape. Now the story had several possibilities, and none could simply be declared proven. Perhaps two similar conversations took place, perhaps different recordings captured different portions, perhaps material had been combined, perhaps the dates were being misremembered, or perhaps the recordings had reached the hobbyists in some way far more complicated than a random live interception. The question was no longer how one man with a scanner got lucky. Now it was this: why could more than one listener, in roughly the same part of England, apparently obtain remarkably clear material from the same private royal conversation? That question became even harder because of something nobody had examined yet. The tape itself, not what was said on it, the physical audio. Because if Renan really had captured the recording the way he described, the tape should carry certain technical fingerprints, the marks of a signal travelling through the route he claimed. In 1993, specialists began examining those fingerprints. And what they found didn't match the story Britain had been told. But before the engineers entered this story, there's another mystery worth following. Because whatever the Sun knew in August 1992, the newspaper hadn't just discovered that Diana's private conversation existed, it had been aware of a recording for a very long time. And for more than 2 years, the tape stayed out of print. The next question isn't how it was recorded, it's why a private conversation that could have caused an immediate royal sensation was allowed to sit. And why, in the summer of 1992, somebody finally decided its time had come. Renan said he took his recording to the Sun not long after making it. According to Anthony Holden's near-contemporary reconstruction in Vanity Fair, the newspaper had access to the material for more than 2 years before publishing it in August 1992. Think about what that means. One of the most explosive private conversations, involving the Princess of Wales, was sitting inside a newspaper organisation, while almost nobody outside knew it existed. Why wait? The answer isn't a conspiracy. It's something more uncomfortable in its own way. Before June 1992, printing an intimate tape of Diana carried enormous risk. She was still one of the most popular women in Britain. Publishing a private conversation could make the newspaper look less like an exposer of hypocrisy and more like the intruder. Then Andrew Morton's book changed everything. In June 1992, Diana, Her True Story, reached the public. The book tore through the old understanding of the Wales marriage. Diana's unhappiness, her eating disorder, episodes of self-harm, the breakdown of the marriage, Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Stories that had lived as Fleet Street whispers were suddenly being presented in devastating detail. After Morton, readers had already been told the fairy tale marriage was badly damaged. The boundary had moved, and once that boundary moved, the tape became easier to sell as part of an existing royal story rather than an attack appearing out of nowhere. Later accounts add more pressure. Time, drawing on Tina Brown's account, says the Sun had regarded the recording as too risky until the wider circumstances changed, and that the American National Enquirer's acquisition of the material increased urgency. Vanity Fair pointed to something even more immediate, a brutal circulation battle between the Sun and the Daily Mirror. Then Sarah Ferguson handed that circulation war a grenade. In August 1992, long-lens photographs of the separated Duchess of York holidaying in the south of France with John Bryan appeared in the British press. The images caused an enormous sensation. The Mirror had a story everyone was talking about. According to Holden's account, the Sun answered by reaching into its safe for the Diana tape. Look at the sequence. For more than 2 years, the recording apparently wasn't considered safe enough to detonate. Then Morton's book changed the public understanding of the marriage. The royal family entered one of the ugliest summers it had faced in decades. Sarah Ferguson's private life became front-page spectacle. Newspapers were fighting for readers. And suddenly, Diana's old telephone conversation became publishable. A private recording can sit unused for years, not because nobody wants it, but because editors are waiting for the moment when publishing it becomes commercially survivable. And by August 1992, that moment had arrived. Some people saw a different pattern. Morton had exposed damaging claims about Charles. Then an intimate recording appeared that could embarrass Diana. If you already believed different royal camps were briefing against each other, the timing looked almost too perfect. But a pattern noticed after the fact isn't evidence of coordination. There's no authenticated record showing Charles, Buckingham Palace, or anyone acting for Charles ordering the Sun to release the tape. What we do have is a private recording that became dramatically more valuable as the Wales marriage turned into a public information war. And once the Sun decided to use it, the paper didn't simply tell readers that a tape existed. It did something far more invasive. It gave Britain the chance to listen. There's a difference between reading that somebody had a private conversation and hearing the conversation yourself. The Sun understood that difference precisely. When the newspaper pushed Squidgygate into public view, it didn't stop with a headline and selected quotations. The transcript was published, and readers were offered access to a telephone hotline where they could hear the recording with their own ears. Vanity Fair's account put the number of listeners at roughly 60,000. Think about what that required in 1992. There was no social media feed, no clip automatically appearing on your phone, no algorithm placing 30 seconds of leaked audio in front of millions before breakfast. You had to participate. You bought the paper, you saw the number, you picked up your telephone, you dialed, you waited, and then you listened to a woman speaking in a conversation she'd never agreed to share with you. That makes the ethical line unusually clear. This wasn't simply information entering the public domain. It was eavesdropping turned into a consumer experience. Vanity Fair reported that those tens of thousands of listeners collectively spent more than $150,000. The Sun, after being accused of electronic voyeurism, offered profits to the NSPCC, a charity associated with Diana. The charity refused the money. That refusal says more than any editorial. Whatever one thought about Diana's relationship with Gilbey, the method used to expose it had become part of the story. Even people who believed the conversation reflected badly on Diana could still ask whether they had any right to hear it. And here's what made this intrusion different from every photograph ever taken of her. Diana could see a camera lens. She couldn't see whoever had access to the signal carrying her voice. A photograph steals a moment you can see being taken. This stole the sound of Diana believing nobody outside the call was present. And for a short time, much of the argument centered on Diana. Had she behaved properly? What did her friendship with Gilbey mean? Was she entitled to complain about Charles after talking this way to another man? Those were easy questions for newspapers, because they kept attention on the contents. But another question was beginning to move underneath them. Who had made it possible for the public to hear any of this? Because Cyril Renan's explanation depended on something simple. An analog mobile call had gone out over the air. His scanner had caught it. His tape recorder had preserved it. If that story was right, the recording should behave like an off-air mobile interception. It should carry the technical fingerprints of the route Renan described. In 1993, specialists began examining those fingerprints, and parts of the tape didn't behave the way they expected at all. The basic question is simple. Could Cyril Renan really have made that recording with the equipment he said he was using? Start with what wasn't unusual. Britain's early analog mobile telephone systems weren't private the way modern digital calls are. A mobile phone communicated with a nearby base station by radio. If somebody nearby had the right receiver, parts of mobile telephone traffic could sometimes be overheard. So the claim that a radio enthusiast might accidentally hear a mobile call wasn't ridiculous. That matters because it's easy, looking back from the age of encrypted smartphones, to make the original story sound impossible from the start. It wasn't. The problem came from the details. Diana wasn't on the mobile. Gilbey was. She was using a landline at Sandringham, while his side of the conversation travelled through the cellular network. Picture the call simply. Diana speaks into a normal telephone. Her voice enters the fixed telephone network. The system connects to the mobile network serving Gilbey. The mobile network sends radio traffic between a base station and his car phone. Renan's claim was that his scanner picked up that radio portion. But if that's the route the recording took, engineers should expect certain limits in the audio. Those limits weren't there. Surveillance consultant William Parsons argued that capturing both sides of the conversation with such even clarity under the claimed circumstances was improbable enough to deserve suspicion. That concern became one of the reasons the simple chance interception account began attracting serious technical criticism. Then the Sunday Times commissioned a more detailed examination. The surveillance firm Audiotel International studied the recording in 1993. Their investigators focused on something most listeners would never notice: little sounds buried in the tape, data bursts. Think of them as electronic housekeeping signals. The network talking to itself, rather than two human beings talking to each other. According to the reported analysis, the tape contained bursts that shouldn't have appeared in that form if the recording had simply traveled through the cellular system as claimed. There was also a background hum. On its own, a hum sounds like nothing. On an audio analysis, it can matter enormously. The hum wasn't consistent with what Renan's scanner equipment should have captured. It was considered more suggestive of material taken from a fixed telephone line. That raised a very different possibility. What if somebody had obtained the conversation somewhere else first, directly from the landline, and then transmitted it again over radio frequencies where hobbyists could pick it up? That's the rebroadcast theory. And suddenly, Renan's January 4th date makes a different kind of sense. If the original conversation took place on New Year's Eve, but somebody replayed it over the air days later, a man with a scanner could genuinely have recorded it on a different date. He could be telling the truth about his experience while being completely unaware that the signal reaching his equipment had already passed through somebody else's hands first. Other analysts pushed the findings further. John Nelson, of Crew Green Consulting, working with audio specialist Martin Collins, examined the tape's frequency content and argued it didn't fit an ordinary off-air recording through the type of receiver Renan used. Their work also described a 50 Hz electrical hum, the kind associated more naturally with a recording taken from a landline than one intercepted from mobile radio traffic. Then Cellnet weighed in. Gilbey's mobile service was on the Cellnet network. After Squidgygate became public, Cellnet examined the matter because an allegation that somebody had simply intercepted one of its calls over the air was a direct problem for the company. Accounts of that inquiry say Cellnet became satisfied that the recording couldn't be explained as straightforward eavesdropping on its mobile network. And now the story had changed completely. The first version required almost no conspiracy at all. A man with a scanner gets lucky. The technical evidence raised something far more awkward. The hobbyists may have genuinely recorded something over the radio, but they may not have been receiving the original live call. If somebody had recorded the conversation through another route, cleaned it up, then sent it back out over the air, that would make amateur listeners look like original interceptors when they were really only the final receivers. It would also explain why more than one person in the same part of England apparently obtained material from the same conversation. But here is where discipline matters. Technical analysts saying a tape looks inconsistent with an ordinary scanner interception does not tell us who made the original recording. It doesn't identify MI5. It doesn't identify GCHQ. It doesn't identify Charles. It doesn't identify anyone. Forensic audio analysis can challenge a story. It can show that parts of an explanation don't fit. It can suggest a different mechanism. What it can't do, without additional evidence, is supply the name of the person who pressed record. And that name, the person or organization behind the original recording, is the gap at the center of this entire story. Every answer creates another question. Renan says he intercepted it by chance. Then another listener appears. The dates don't align. Experts challenge the audio. A rebroadcast becomes technically plausible, but the person behind that possible rebroadcast remains invisible. If you value Diana's story told with evidence rather than gossip, take a moment to subscribe and like this video. It genuinely helps us keep making the kind of royal history that separates what can be proved from what simply became legend. And there's more to come in this story. Because what happened next moved the mystery from Fleet Street into the halls of government. That should have been the point at which a serious inquiry either proved the scanner explanation or found out what had really happened. Instead, the argument moved into politics, because these weren't two anonymous citizens whose calls might have been intercepted. One of them was the Princess of Wales, and by early 1993, concern about the tapes had reached Buckingham Palace, senior civil servants, MI5 and GCHQ. We know this because Robert Fellows, the Queen's former private secretary and Diana's brother-in-law, was questioned about it at Diana's inquest. Fellows described high-level meetings and correspondence involving Buckingham Palace, senior civil servants, and the heads of MI5 and GCHQ. By then, there were two deeply embarrassing recordings involving the future king and his wife, both originating from private telephone conversations in late 1989. The palace wasn't simply annoyed about newspaper coverage. People responsible for the security of the monarchy were discussing whether somebody had found a way into private royal communications. Fellows said the Queen had concerns about what had happened. Prince Charles, according to his evidence, wanted the security services rather than the police to investigate. Think about what that means. The heir to the throne had heard his own private words appear in public. Diana had experienced the same thing, and inside Buckingham Palace, the possibility of a proper security investigation was serious enough to reach the heads of Britain's Domestic Security Service and its Signals Intelligence Agency. Now, weaker versions of this story here, MI5 and GCHQ were involved in discussions, and turn that into MI5 and GCHQ were caught bugging Diana. That's not what the evidence says. If senior royal officials suspected a security breach, MI5 and GCHQ were exactly the organizations you'd expect to be consulted. Being part of the discussion doesn't mean being behind the breach. But for a moment, it looked as though the palace might actually get the technical inquiry that could settle the argument. Then it stopped. According to Fellows' evidence at the 2008 inquest, the proposal was blocked by Kenneth Clarke, the Home Secretary, in 1993. Fellows said Clarke was concerned that an investigation itself could be misunderstood or leaked to the press. That decision is one of the most frustrating moments in the entire Squidgygate story. This was early 1993. The tapes were fresh. The newspapers involved could still be questioned. The technical systems were still operating. The people responsible for royal security were still in place. If there was ever a moment when somebody might have established exactly what had happened, this was it. Michael Mansfield QC pressed Fellows on that point at the inquest. Was there ultimately an investigation? Fellows' answer was simple. There wasn't. And while the palace was deciding whether to investigate, the government was giving Parliament a very firm public answer. On the 20th of January 1993, MP David Alton asked Prime Minister John Major about government policy concerning the tapping of telephones belonging to members of the royal family or their friends. Major's written answer pointed to the Interception of Communications Act 1985. Then came the line that matters. He said there was no substance to rumours, that the security and intelligence agencies were involved in intercepting royal communications. Not, we don't know. Not, we're investigating. No substance. There is no released order showing MI5 was told to record Diana. No authenticated GCHQ log, proving it made the Gilbey tape. No declassified document showing Charles ordered Diana's telephone bugged. No inquest finding that the palace ran an operation against her. But there's an uncomfortable tension. Privately, the palace was concerned enough for senior figures to discuss an inquiry involving Britain's security establishment. Publicly, the government was telling Parliament that intelligence involvement had no substance. And the proposed investigation that might have reconciled those positions was blocked before it ever began. 15 years later, the argument came back into a courtroom, this time through a man who hadn't been sitting behind a newspaper desk or inside Whitehall. He'd been standing beside Diana. Ken Wharf wasn't a distant commentator. He had protected her. Wharf served as a royal protection officer and guarded Diana, William and Harry for years, remaining in that role until 1993. That gave him direct experience of the security culture surrounding the Princess of Wales at exactly the period Squidgygate erupted. When he appeared at Diana's inquest in January 2008, he said something extraordinary. Worf told the hearing that he believed GCHQ had made the original recording, not that GCHQ might have. He said it was his belief that the internal recording was probably made by GCHQ. His explanation wasn't the conspiracy version. Worf suggested intelligence monitoring may have been connected to the security threat from the IRA. In his view, members of the royal family could have been monitored because they were potential terrorist targets. Then he connected that belief directly to the problem with Renan and Norgrove. Worf said he believed the Diana Gilbey conversation had been released over the airwaves on a loop so that radio hobbyists could pick it up. If that were true, several strange details would suddenly fit together. A conversation taking place on one date could be recorded by Renan on another. More than one amateur could obtain the same material. The technical qualities that worried specialists would have an explanation. The hobbyists could genuinely have recorded something over the radio without being the people who first intercepted the original call. It's a remarkably neat theory. But Worf was explaining what he believed had happened. He wasn't presenting the court with operational paperwork proving it. No GCHQ authorization bearing Diana's name was produced. No authenticated interception log was placed in evidence. No released instruction showed somebody ordering the conversation rebroadcast. Worf's proximity to Diana makes his belief important. It doesn't transform belief into documentary proof, but he gave another piece of evidence that lands differently. Worf told the inquest that Diana confirmed to him she was the woman on the squidgy tape, and then he said something that creates one of the most quietly devastating images in this entire story. He said Diana called the newspaper's telephone line to listen to the recording herself, the Princess of Wales, dialing a newspaper hotline, to hear her own private telephone conversation being sold back to the British public. She wasn't listening to a rumor about herself, she was listening to herself. Worf also testified that the Queen had told Diana she was unhappy about the tape. Put that beside Fellows' evidence. Discussions occurred, a security service investigation was contemplated, and it was ultimately blocked, and a pattern emerges. Diana knew the recording was genuine. The Queen was concerned. Royal security figures recognized there was a problem. Senior intelligence officials became part of the discussion. One of Diana's former protection officers later accused GCHQ. The government denied intelligence involvement, and no completed public investigation ever settled the argument. That isn't proof of a conspiracy, it's proof of an unresolved security question that nobody in power ever chose to answer. And if Squidgygate had been the only private royal conversation to surface, perhaps the story would eventually have faded into one strange accident of analog technology. But it wasn't the only one. Another tape existed. Another royal voice had been captured, and this time the man speaking wasn't Diana's friend, it was Charles. The second recording changed the problem because it removed Diana from the center of it. If only Diana's conversation had appeared, people could build theories around Diana alone. Perhaps somebody wanted to embarrass her. Perhaps a hostile royal faction targeted her specifically. But then came Charles and Camilla. Their private telephone conversation dated from December 1989, only around 2 weeks before the Diana Gilbey call. It too contained intimate material never intended for public hearing. The full conversation wouldn't appear in the British press until January 1993, although newspapers had begun referring to the tape before then. The famous sexual joke from that conversation became almost impossible to escape. We don't need to repeat it, that's not the part that matters here. What matters is that another senior royal had suffered essentially the same violation. A private telephone conversation, recorded without the speaker's knowledge, held for a period, then carried into the press. And suddenly, the Squidgygate question widened. If Diana had been specifically targeted, why had Charles's most intimate private speech also ended up on tape? There was also an important technical difference. Later accounts of the Charles-Camilla tape have generally treated the off-air interception explanation more favorably. Tina Brown, cited by Time, argued that analysis of the radio signals embedded in the Charles-Camilla tape strongly supported the view that it really had been recorded off-air. That prevents us from treating every royal tape as though it carried the same technical fingerprints. They didn't necessarily. The existence of Camillagate doesn't prove somebody rebroadcast Squidgygate. It proves something broader. Royal telephone privacy, at the end of the analog era, was dangerously vulnerable, and the press knew those recordings had value. According to later reporting, the person who obtained the Charles Camilla tape held onto it for years and only recognized its commercial potential after Squidgygate showed what a private royal recording could be worth. The tape was then taken to the Daily Mirror in 1992. One leaked royal conversation didn't merely expose one person. It created a market for another. That chain reaction reached Parliament. On 10 June 1993, MPs debated privacy and media intrusion. The language used in the House is striking, because it sounds less like a discussion about celebrity gossip and more like a warning about technology itself. Gerald Kaufman, speaking about the National Heritage Select Committee, said the committee had become convinced that modern technology used to intercept and record private conversations had got completely out of hand. He explicitly noted that alleged conversations involving members of the royal family had become the focal point of public concern. Parliament had to wrestle with two competing principles. A free press has the right to investigate powerful people. Royal status can't become a shield against legitimate reporting. But being a public figure doesn't automatically make every private conversation public property. Those labels, Squidgygate, Camillagate, make the episodes sound almost comic, but underneath them was a legal and ethical problem Britain hadn't solved. Technology was moving faster than expectations of privacy. A scanner could reach places a photographer couldn't. A recording could preserve a private sentence forever. And once that sentence reached a newsroom, circulation figures created their own pressure to publish. And while Westminster debated, events inside the Wales marriage had already moved beyond any parliamentary remedy. By December 1992, the pretense was over. At 3:30 in the afternoon on 9 December, Prime Minister John Major stood in the House of Commons with a statement from Buckingham Palace. Charles and Diana had decided to separate. There were no plans to divorce. Their constitutional positions would remain unchanged. They would both continue raising William and Harry and carry out separate public engagements. The recording didn't end their marriage. The relationship was already badly damaged before Britain heard Diana talking to Gilbey. Morton's book had exposed private turmoil months earlier. Public scrutiny was relentless. Separate lives were becoming harder to hide. Squidgygate entered that environment. It made it harsher. It gave newspapers more private material. It gave Diana's critics ammunition. But chronology isn't causation. And near the end of the palace statement came a sentence that lands very differently when you know what had happened 4 months earlier. The Queen and Prince Philip expressed the hope that the intrusions into Charles and Diana's privacy might now cease. They said privacy and understanding were needed so the couple could provide a secure upbringing for their children. In August, the public had been offered access to Diana's private conversation for the price of a phone call. In December, Buckingham Palace was asking for privacy. Both Charles and Diana had lost private words to the press. Both were living inside a marriage whose collapse had become national entertainment. And William and Harry were growing up while adults argued over tapes, books, lovers, briefings, and blame. But one part of Squidgygate remained beyond Diana's control long after the separation was announced. Millions had heard other people interpret her voice. Newspapers had decided what the affection meant. Commentators had decided what kind of woman the recording revealed. When Martin Bashir finally put James Gilbey's name directly to her in 1995, Diana had something she hadn't possessed in August 1992: the chance to answer for herself. Bashir asked what she had felt when news broke that a telephone conversation between her and Gilbey had been recorded. Diana's first instinct wasn't to talk about her own embarrassment. She talked about Gilbey. She said she'd felt protective of him because he'd been a good friend, and she couldn't bear the thought that his life might be damaged simply through his connection with her. Had the conversation happened? Yes, we did. Absolutely we did. Was Gilbey affectionate? Yes. Had they maintained an adulterous relationship? Not true. Then Bashir pushed the story into darker territory. Did she know how the conversation had reached the press? Diana said she didn't. But she believed publication had been intended to harm her. She described the conflict around the marriage as something like a poker or chess game, with each side conscious of who held which cards. That was Diana's interpretation. She didn't produce evidence showing Charles had ordered the tape released. She didn't identify the interceptor. What she explained was how the episode felt from her side. She believed she'd learned what it meant to be outside the protection of the family. And Squidgygate had another consequence that stretched far beyond James Gilbey. After your private telephone conversation has genuinely been recorded and published, the idea that somebody might be listening again stops being abstract. There's a word that has followed Diana through many accounts of her later life: paranoid. Sometimes it's used casually, as though every fear she expressed can be placed in one box and dismissed. The evidence doesn't allow that. It also doesn't allow us to say every suspicion Diana ever held was correct. Those are two different mistakes. At the inquest, Michael Gibbons, Diana's former private secretary, was asked whether she had ever told him directly that she feared her calls were being monitored. He said she hadn't expressed that concern in words, but her actions told him something. Gibbons said Diana changed her telephone number in a way that made it clear to him monitoring was a concern. That's valuable precisely because it's restrained. He didn't claim Diana showed him proof of MI5 surveillance. He said her behavior indicated concern. And by then, Diana had a concrete reason to know that private communications could fail her. Squidgygate was real. A conversation she hadn't authorized for publication had been recorded. Its route into public circulation remained disputed. The amateur radio explanation, as the Guardian's inquest reporting noted, had never been proved. Then, in 1995, Bashir arrived with supposed evidence that people close to Diana or the royal households were receiving secret payments. Some of that evidence was false. Dyson's investigation established that. But Dyson's report also reveals why the material found fertile ground. Earl Spencer told the investigation that Diana had already felt watched. Press reports containing things she believed she'd only told close friends had made her unsettled. Allegations of secret payments seemed to fit fears she already had. The history becomes painfully circular. Diana had suffered genuine invasions of privacy. Those invasions made later claims of betrayal easier to believe. Then Bashir introduced fabricated evidence into that environment. Squidgygate didn't cause panorama. Diana didn't believe Bashir only because of the Gilbey tape. But after 1992, she no longer had to be told that a private telephone conversation could escape. She'd lived through it. The safer question isn't whether Diana was paranoid. It's which of her fears had evidence behind them, which were understandable reactions to real breaches, and which remain unsupported. That's a harder question. It's also a fairer one. So after all of that, strip away the nickname, strip away 30 years of theories, strip away the jokes. What can the evidence actually prove? The answer is narrower than the scandal became, and more revealing. Diana confirmed the conversation. The tape was real. That's settled. The recording establishes a relationship in which Diana felt able to speak with unusual emotional freedom. Gilbey's affection is there. Diana's trust is there. Her dependence on his reassurance is there. What the recording doesn't independently establish is a sexual affair. Diana expressly denied that conclusion. The call gave the public access to a version of Diana that public appearances couldn't provide. Not the real Diana, as though every other version were fake. A private Diana. The one speaking without knowing strangers would someday analyze her pauses, irritations, jokes and fears. That's the secret voice in this story. The original account of how the recording was obtained never became a clean, universally established explanation. Inquest reporting still described the amateur radio account as unproved. That matters. But uncertainty is not an invitation to fill the empty space with whichever suspect we prefer. There is no authenticated public evidence proving that GCHQ, MI5, Charles, the Queen, or Buckingham Palace ordered Diana's conversation recorded. Ken Wharf stated his belief. Senior officials discussed the tapes. The palace considered investigation. The government publicly denied intelligence involvement. None of those facts supplies the missing interception order. None identifies the person who first captured the call. That part remains unresolved. And maybe that's the most important thing Squidgygate teaches us. Britain learned an embarrassing pet name. Diana learned something far more serious. Status couldn't guarantee privacy. Palace walls couldn't guarantee privacy. A private telephone line couldn't guarantee privacy. She could lower her voice because she believed she was speaking to one person. And somewhere between Sandringham, a mobile network, radio listeners and a newspaper office, that voice could become property, belonging to everyone except her. That's the part of Squidgygate that survives after the gossip burns away. We can argue forever about who made the first recording. The public record may never give us that name, but we don't have to guess what was taken. Diana told us herself. So don't leave her trapped inside that recording. Leave the scanner. Leave the newspaper hotline. Leave MI5, GCHQ, and every theory where the evidence stops. Go back instead to the Diana people actually met. A car door opens. She steps out. There are people waiting behind barriers, hands reaching forward, someone nervous because the Princess of Wales is suddenly standing only a few feet away. And Diana speaks. That familiar public voice returns, measured when it needs to be, warm when somebody is frightened, quick with a joke when the moment allows it. For years, that was the voice millions believed they knew. Squidgygate didn't reveal that voice to be false. It revealed that it was only one part of her. Behind it was another woman who could be impatient, angry, funny, wounded, suspicious, affectionate, and desperately in need of somebody she trusted. Not Saint Diana. Not scandalous Diana. Diana when she believed the room was private. If you remember the summer of 1992, I'd like to know how you saw it then, and whether, looking back now, you think the press crossed a line by turning that conversation into something the public could listen to. Leave your view in the comments. And if you want Diana's story handled this way, evidence, not gossip, subscribe. Because there's another private call from that same period that raises a different set of questions entirely. Only weeks before Diana's conversation was recorded, Charles and Camilla had spoken privately too. When their tape finally reached the public, Squidgygate no longer looked like an isolated royal embarrassment. It looked like the beginning of a much bigger problem.